Well, we've got a great guest with us this week. I mean, it sounds like we do a podcast every week. It's about every month, maybe, if we're lucky. But this week or this month, we've got a very special guest at the Govern Early Medieval podcast, and it's the author, Alex Harvey. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm well. I've just done a 26-mile hike around the Yorkshire Dales, so I'm pretty knackered. But the brain is never tired. I've been thinking about Viking armies and Strathclyde all day in anticipation.
Well, Strathclyde is good because actually for a podcast the base in the centre of Strathclyde, that we've kind of talked about a lot of the stones. We've talked about the Govan School and like the Eldersley Cross, which is a great cross. It's got its own sacred shrine. Well, a sort of a spring that's still babbling away. But I think what we probably not talked about so much is the kind of the context, the sort of polity that it was in. And of course, we discussed it with you. I believe you're coming maybe next month to see us. And on a tour, we discuss it with our visitors because we have to contextualize, what is Strathclyde, what is the Kingdom of Altclut. But you've written a book on the Forgotten Vikings, but actually we'll go back to the future, as it were. We'll look at a book that you've got coming out later in the year, because I believe in that you'll touch quite heavily on these elusive Clyde Britons. I don't know how you like to refer to them, as the Altclutians or the Strathclyders, because the fascinating thing about them is during this period, their name changes, and what their aim is, what their focus is, where their geographical focus changes in the middle of our period, which is, it's quite confusing to explain to some of our visitors, saying, okay, up to 870 there's this, then after 870 there's this. So maybe you can tell us just a little bit about your background, and then a little bit about this book, and then we'll delve in maybe from Strathclyde, and then we'll work our way out from there. So Alex, thanks again, and take it away. Let us know who you are and what you do.
No, thank you for having me. As Tom said, my name is Alex Harvey. So I'm currently an author. I got into writing history books from reading history books. I'm an archaeologist. I did my undergrad and masters at the University of York, blessed to be taught by such brainiacs like Ashby, Hadley, Milner, Henson, and other such greats. Through doing academia and a couple of conferences after the fact, and in the build up to a few tentative PhD ideas, one thing that really struck a chord within me was not necessarily just learning academia and learning facts about the past and interrogating the past, but then disseminating that complex information in entertaining or unique formats, so that the broadest possible audience can understand things like Strathclyde, which, you're right, it's a confusing subject. It's rare amongst early medieval kingdoms to have such a blatant name change in the middle of its timeline. That there's the history of Altclut, if you like, and then you can just kind of end it at 870 when Dumbarton Rock is besieged. But that's not the end. It transmutes, it moves to the centre that you're now in, and it becomes its whole other thing. There's like another 250 years, pushing into 300 years of history, and obviously, there's more history beyond that. But I mean, that's just one example. I'm fascinated by obscure early medieval kingdoms. Most people will have heard of the big names: Wessex, Northumbria, Mercia. Even people who perhaps aren't really into, or don't know they're into, the early medieval period, they'll have heard those names. They may have heard them from such shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom, or maybe video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example. But sandwiched between those big realms were so many ephemeral, secondary or transient units that their stories don't have neat endings. They don't have big characters. They don't have arcs that you could base a TV show around. If you imagine, the history of all of these little kingdoms as the branches of a tree, some of these branches just fizzle out. And I'm fascinated with those smaller branches, the really flimsy ones that kind of flake away in the wind. And that's not to disparage Strathclyde. If anything, Strathclyde's quite a big kingdom in the context of my next book. Some of the smallest ones are, the length of a small stream. Just to use Scotland as an example, there's a few murky, half-remembered Pictish kingdoms to the north of Glasgow. Some of them definitely real. Others, we're not sure if they're kind of retrospective romanticisation of names. But with Strathclyde, for me, we're talking about a substantial kingdom, and the very fact that a big Viking army from different provenances as well, we're talking Irish in there, probably some English as well, and Scandinavian, the fact that they went to the effort of besieging and capturing what was the capital of Strathclyde, it makes you question why. Was there an interest in Strathclyde? And clearly the kingdom was substantial enough so that the capital could fall, and it still persevered. The dynasty, or semblances of that dynasty, remained at a different place. So stories like that, of the rise and fall of these ephemeral, lost realms, the romantic, of course. That's the focus of my next book, Little Kingdoms, which releases on the 30th of November this year.
And it's quite interesting there that you're talking about Strathclyde, you're talking about Altclut changing. I mean, for people who may be new to the subject, there's references in the Annals of Ulster, so contemporary Irish histories, to a Viking siege of Altclut, which is Dumbarton Rock. Clut is what becomes Clyde or Clud in the future, but Dumbarton is actually the Gaelic name for it, but it means the same thing, the fort of the Britons. And the Vikings actually put a 4-month siege on it. And people, Alex will know better than most people, you don't do sieges in the early medieval period because you don't have siege engines, you don't have trebuchets. So if you're up, if you're up at like an Edrus, like a citadel on the top of Dumbarton Rock, it's only, as it seems to be, when you run out of water or supplies that you actually have to give up. But basically it falls, and the next year, again, no doubt it's in Alex's book, the Vikings go back to Dublin apparently with 200 ships full of slaves, and the slaves are, I think they're Anglo-Saxons, they're Britons, they're Picts, they're Scots. They've obviously just been a year on a slave raiding exhibition. And you know about Vikings a lot as well, don't you? Because your current book, as it were, is Forgotten Vikings. And I suppose a lot, the Vikings in the centre of Scotland are kind of forgotten Vikings in a way as well. It's not the story you hear of them being in the islands. It's not about being in Ireland and the Great Army and in the south of England and the Low Countries. We've got our own forgotten Vikings here. If you now just tell us a little bit about your book, Forgotten Vikings.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'm jumping the gun, aren't I, talking about the next gun while the current one's still out and kicking. The history of the Viking Age in Scotland is fascinating. So too is the history of how it's been studied. Even going back 5-6 years, when I was first learning about Viking Age Scotland, it was framed, the central question is, what happened to the Picts? And obviously there's the wider quote-unquote Pictish problem, who are the Picts? But what's interesting is that to even start to unpick the impact of raiders and later invaders in Scotland is to do so from a perspective of wondering what happened to the population. And then you're already almost kind of falling into two different pitfalls of, it was either some kind of genocide, which in the early medieval period really doesn't happen, or some kind of mass cultural assimilation. It's a debate that has, of course, crystallised discussions about the Viking Age impact in England for ages. I think we're slowly coming out of that debate with brilliant books like The Life in the Viking Great Army, that's just come out, of course. But in Scotland, certainly there are less eyes on the Viking Age, which is a shame. It's obviously right in the middle of those two places you mentioned, the seminal Ireland and England. And I think reading between the lines of the Irish annals you mentioned and the siege of Dumbarton in 870, to have access to Ireland and England, the trade routes between the Irish Sea, you have to think about Scotland. Clearly, the leaders of the raiding armies were thinking about Scotland. They were thinking about Strathclyde or Altclut, and they thought, yeah, this is our way in. You know, why else are you spending the resources, the time, the manpower for a 4-month siege? I mean, it's special for the early medieval period.
And that's it. And we know after 870 that we've got, when they looked at the Carrick golf course, when they were building that on the west bank of Loch Lomond, they found evidence for Viking burials and potentially Viking settlement as well. And that's even above and beyond. There's a cenotaph there. There's a Viking age burial without a body. And there's also the Luss hogback as well. And, you know, where we are today, and I know you're probably looking forward to seeing our hogbacks, but a lot of people don't know there's a hogback that you can see any time of the day or night. Essentially, it's in Luss churchyards. So, but most people won't know about that. And the way that a lot of people won't know about the sort of treasures that we've got in Govan, I think we've got a kindred spirit here with Alex, that, you know, he's interested in these ones that almost seem to fall between the gaps, because you'll know about the Picts, you'll know about the Northumbrians, but what's in you'll know about St Columba, or you know about our St Constantine. And I suppose that's really getting the sense that that is your wider interest in research. It's the sort of forgotten kingdom, the forgotten voices. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. I mean, how I got into writing was a few stern words from my wife. For one, she said, "Stop moaning, you're not doing enough. Why don't you write a history book?" And an encouragement from my parents. The first book, and which is 2 years old now, is an early medieval history book of where I'm from, which is a really just backwater, forgotten corner of the UK called the Isle of Axholme. Sounds a lot more exciting than it is at the moment. It's not an island. It hasn't been for about 400 years. It was drained from 1627 onwards. But the topography's changed massively. You wouldn't think it was once an island now. It's basically flat North Lincolnshire farmland, as far as the eye can see. A couple hills, and it's on the border with South Yorkshire. So it's a liminal zone, and I love liminal zones. These areas that are in the middle of things, so you think they're probably not important, because they're on the edge of everyone's greater interests. But if you think about Venn diagrams, if you're on the edge of multiple overlapping spheres, you're actually in the middle. But a recent kind of paradigm shift, I suppose, in some areas of Viking Age archaeology is looking at these liminal zones. You mentioned the Low Countries, Frisia. That's a massive in-between zone that's really important to understanding the Viking Age impact in England. And I researched that in my undergraduate. And that was my first kind of big project. My dissertation was on the Viking impact in Frisia. And moving from that, I was looking at the history of the Isle of Axholme, which hadn't been tackled before 1066 at all. And I thought, looking at the place names, looking at the similar landscape to the Low Countries, and even some of the early modern history, we had a lot of Dutch migrants. And there's a lot of convergences there. It's another marshland area that's sandwiched between much larger kingdoms. You've got Northumbria to the north of the River Humber, although slightly to the south as well, and also Mercia. And the Isle of Axholme was a small unit between those two, and also Lindsey, which is another kind of secondary kingdom. So since starting my writing career in 2023, you're quite right that I've tried to give a microphone to all of these hidden voices. And I do so because I think not that any popular period of history, World War II, World War I, the Viking Age, can ever be a closed book. We can always reopen these books and talk about the periods from new perspectives. But the lesser known elements, for example, Viking activity in Spain, that's really not talked about in England. These are the kind of things that I want to bring to wide audiences. And you'll know this as well, Tom. We swim in different but complementary oceans. You've got the academic world, where ideas are swirling around all the time. It's a maelstrom of thought. And some things might be obvious in the academic world. This notion of liminal zones. We think, oh yeah, that's been around, yeah, we know where we are. But in the kind of audience of people who pick up a book from Waterstones, who are getting into history, getting into archaeology, and they want to learn a little bit more than the average history book, that's kind of how I see my role, and that's where I want to come in and provide that scaffold for the next generation of people to learn about history, archaeology, the Viking Age, whatever. Just like I was inspired by the authors that I'm really grateful to know and work alongside today, people like Max Adams, Thomas Williams, Amy Jeff, Hannah Vidine, brilliant names.
And that's it. So, your role, you see it, if you're a kid and you've been inspired by watching maybe The Last Kingdom. I don't know if that's beyond most kids' bedtimes. I don't know when it was on, or the Vikings, or even if the world of Tolkien, either the Hobbit films or the Lord of the Rings films. You sort of see yourself as being in that, as it were, a liminal zone of yourself. You're writing the kind of bridging books between, I like this period. I've maybe had a quick look on Wikipedia and saying, this is based on these characters, these figures, but you're the one that says Olaf and Ivar, that's what we're talking about, and this is why they're important, this is why they came from, this is why they're different. Would that be a good characterization of what you do and want to do?
It's a very flattering characterisation, which I will take gladly. Framing me as this kind of knowledge gatekeeper, yeah, I'll happily take that. But each book, and I find it's really important to stress this. Each book, Riddles of the Isle, Forgotten Vikings, and the next one, Little Kingdoms, they stand atop a mountain of scholarship. People like yourself, who I read and research, and then your arguments, the arguments of people like Alex Wolff, they'll enter my brain, they'll swirl around with other arguments, and then they form something new. I mean, that's the whole joy of academia, and being at the bridge point between academia and the general public. Like you, I work in museums, so you see what the general public are interested in, you see how they interact with the past, and then in the academic side, you see what new research is coming out, and you think, how can I marry these two together? And the end result is books like mine. It's books like those authors I just mentioned. And it's a privileged position to be able to tell these stories. It's something I really enjoy, something I never take for granted. And being invited to be on podcasts like this is just another piece of the pie. It's wonderful.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Just to go back on what you were saying there about, reading the academic works and then saying, this needs to be out there, but a lot of people might not read 100,000 words specifically on one aspect of this, but you can bring that thought. I mean, for example, you'll know the work of Ben Raffield, a great scholar, or particularly if you're looking at sort of the militaristic elements of the early medieval period. He was an article, a fairly recent one, he's referencing a term that I hadn't heard before, but shatter zones. And you were talking about liminal spaces and shatter zones. And shatter zones basically is the idea that in the early medieval world, particularly early medieval Britain, Ireland, say, your Francia, and the Low Countries, Frisia, and places like that, that places that are getting smashed up by the Vikings, and then they're having to kind of put the pieces back together. But, it's like, once the window's broken, you can maybe patch it up and sort of stick it back together, but you're going to see the cracks in it, and you're going to see the shatters. And I think he was talking about it in reference to these sort of kingdoms that are being created in this sort of maelstrom of particularly the 9th century. And, so that's the kind of thing that, again, you were talking about as working museums, that we get the visitors here at the Govan Stones, is I'll introduce that term. I'll say Ben Raffield, shatter zones, but then I'll say to them, I'll be looking at a particular zone and saying, like, for those, maybe if we're a video version of this, I've got a Pictish style kind of horse and rider on the Govan Cross or the Jordan Hill Cross behind me, but next to it we've got ones that are showing influence maybe from Northumbria and the Anglo-Scandinavian world. And the way I explain it, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, in particular into Strathclyde, and particularly the pre and post 870 split between the Clyde Britons. Is I see it as a shatter zone. I say it to people, again, I might not explain at length what a shatter zone culture. They're still Christians, they're still warriors, but they're going, actually, that previous culture didn't quite work because we get beaten up. So they seem to be like, I say it's the Clyde Britons 2.0. I mean, talking about Strathclyde is does that seem to make sense for you? When you've been looking at Altclut and the change between Altclut and Strathclyde?
Yeah, that's really interesting points. I mean, the shatter zone terminology, that's another beautiful nugget, isn't it? That 2 words, but they tell us so much, and it's a nice way of reapproaching the same old arguments, the same old time period. To kind of circle back to Strathclyde, starting in Yorkshire, I think what you mentioned there about the impact of Viking armies, the smashing of what's there already, the administrative structures, the territories, the state, if you like, in certain parts of England at least, and Viking armies come in. They certainly have an impact. In some places it's lesser, in other places it's violent impact, in other places it's more peaceful. But certainly there is an impact. And in York, around York, so obviously the area I'm currently based in, I think what's really interesting is that if you look at the distribution of hordes, which are these, in my mind, kind of late career spoils of aged warlords, they represent a massive amount of wealth, time, resources, and hordes, as you all know, that they're not always buried in times of crisis. A lot of the time they're kind of bank deposits, so insurance. So these accumulations of wealth, like the Vale of York hoard, where they're deposited, you'd be likely, if you to go back in time, to find nearby or perhaps right above it a mead hall or some kind of communal gathering point connected to the Scandinavian, Frisian, Baltic, Viking leader, whatever, who's buried there. And you think, okay, so someone with those resources, probably a raid leader, Jarl, whatever term we use, they're going to want to inherit the administrative structure that's already existing, the trade links, the well-maintained roads, the bridges. So you can map these hordes. Vale of York just comes to mind because it's the most recent one I've looked at. And you think, before the Viking Age, what's the territory? Who's where? What are the links? And obviously, we're so used to considering Northumbria as this kind of homogenous block. Really, moving into the 8th century, it's already changed substantially, that the heartlands move away from Bernicia, which Bamber, of course, they cluster around York. That's where most of the coins are. And in the 9th century, Northumbria, it's been around the block a bit. It's a bit like a magpie kingdom, like you mentioned. I think what happens to Northumbria, it's not as obvious as Strathclyde. It's not like a name change and a move of the heartland somewhere else. But I think certainly through Viking raids and inner civil turmoil, you get this shattering of Northumbria. It goes from having a core zone that is York, at least by the 9th century. And then we might now call it the Danelaw by this point. But instead of having one hub where everything's built around, there are multiple smaller hubs. And I think with the hordes, you can map where these important figures of their day, late 10th century Scandinavian warlords, are based. And York, obviously, it retains its importance. I'm not saying it's not a hub. But with studies of the Danelaw, and I'm wary to go off topic here, I think we frame it, at least in pop culture, in the wrong way. We view the Danelaw as this kind of set place with a border at Watling Street that's like a linear zone where, almost like a video game, you cross over from one side and you get a big text screen above your head that says, now in Danish territory. And like there was probably a northern version of that, whatever, and that York was its capital. But the Danelaw is not a kingdom. It can't have a capital because it's not this rigid political hierarchy. Certainly it inherits a lot of the Mercian state, like the trade networks from the Peak District, exporting lead, salt from Droitwich to the Thames, seems to inherit quite a lot of that infrastructure, as the work by Max Adams has kind of highlighted. But it's not this new kingdom that supplants Northumbria. It's not like it arrives from orbit, fully formed. Boom, York's the capital, and it has its kings. These are the kings of the Danelaw. It's nowhere near as simple as that. So I think Northumbria becomes a shatter zone, much like Strathclyde does. And on the notion of inheriting pre-existing power structures, I've talked about the Mercia ones there. Something similar, I suspect, is what happened in Strathclyde. It's not as obvious because there's just less Roman roads and less documented infrastructure from Strathclyde. But you only need to look at a map to see how central Dumbarton Rock would have been in the Irish Sea region. And like I said at the start, these leaders of Viking armies, they're not brutish barbarians like they're often portrayed in the media. They're not invading based on vengeance for Ragnar Lothbrok or because they hate Christians. I think they've sniffed out money, as all pragmatists do, I suppose, as they had been doing in the earlier years of the Viking Age and, of course, before. Pirates, it's what pirates do. And they're like, there's opportunities to be made here, big money. We've got tax, tithing and hydation networks already existing. Let's take over topple the pre-existing dynasty, put ourselves in, and make do with what's left. So a shattering of the power. And then, like you say with that brilliant glass analogy, rebuild it. Might get a bit of blood on your hands. Obviously, you're not going to be picking up glass and injuring yourself. It might happen. And what you've got, I suppose, pieced together after that shattering of a kingdom is a somewhat bloodied stained glass. Some of the pieces might be in a different order, and there might be a few on the floor still. Bit of duct tape. Yeah, but it works. It's flimsy, but it works. And I think, just to kind of round up that analogy, it's certainly what happens in what was Northumbria, happened in quite a lot of Mercia in the Viking Age, and I think that's happening in Strathclyde. It's clear that happens with the sea kingdom of Dalriata, for example. That seems to disappear from the annals, just as mentions of a Norse kingdom of at the Isle of Man and the Hebrides starts to emerge. It seems like that's a transmutation of one into the other. So perhaps the native dynasty taken over. But then we get into a question of what's life like for people like you and I, average Joes. Do they care who they're paying now? Who they have to pay their tax to? Perhaps not.
And on that, I mean, when you're talking about the sort of trade and new ownership potentially as well, we know, for example, we talk about the Gaelicization of the Picts that's coming through Columba and the adoption of Christianity amongst the Picts. But from my perspective, something I looked at in my research, I was looking at kind of lingua francas, if that could be a plural. How do you, because you'll look at place names a lot, you'll look at probably early law codes and annals, and we have interesting things like Dumbarton is from the Gaelic, meaning fort of the Britons, and Outclut is the sort of Welsh, as it were, the Northern Brittonic or Cumbric word for it, which means like height or rock of the Clyde. And there's even there's a formation, a man-made formation of rocks to the north of Loch Lomond. I think it's Clachan Bretan as well, which means sort of rock of the Britons, but it's in Gaelic as well. So how do you feel language is kind of used at that time? Do you think lingua franca was important? Do you think Old Norse is a lingua franca that would, if you're in the late 9th century Britain, it's like you can probably go to any kingdom, and if you've got a bit of Old Norse and a bit of a Brittonic or Celtic language, you think that would be enough? How do you view, particularly when you're looking at liminal zones and these smaller kingdoms that are getting moved and bashed about? How do you think kind of language and that is changing when you're looking at these smaller kingdoms?
Brilliant question. I'll try and neatly structure my answer using 3 examples from different parts of the United Kingdom. I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there was probably, on average, a working understanding of multiple languages for most people, I think, up and down the British Isles. And this is from the late Roman period onwards. Latin was a lot more common, at least some kind of provincial form, maybe what some scholars might call a debased Latin, would have been quite common, alongside, like you mentioned, Brittonic or Celtic, however we want to call some kind of Old Welsh version of the language. Loan words between the two. And then on the East Coast, certainly from place name evidence, the suggestion is that Germanic dialects carried more weight. They were used more in administration. Great linguist Peter Schrever, and forgive me if I've mispronounced his last name, he suggested that there's actually quite a lot more of these loan words between Celtic and Germanic than we first assume. And I'm not a linguist. If there's a debate about this, I'm not throwing my gauntlet down, but I'm just saying that it's interesting that this situation is definitely not a binary split between, Team Germanic who refuse to speak Celtic and Team Celtic who, vice versa. I think it'd be a stretch perhaps to say everyone's bilingual, but certainly there'd be your base language and creolisation, pidgin dialect from a number of others. And importantly, this is before the Viking Age. It's not like the Viking Age suddenly brought international and multilingual people to Britain. They were there already from all over. We've got links from Lincolnshire directly to Africa, Ethiopia. I mean, that's bonkers. 5th, 6th century. So in the Viking Age, as seminal scholar Matthew Townend, one of my big inspirations, has compellingly demonstrated, I think to paraphrase him, there was a great degree of mutual intelligibility between languages, between Old English, Old Norse. First of all, they're similar. Got Old Frisian as well, Old High German, Old Saxon. They're all quite similar. They have the differences, but I think in York, for example, or after a takeover, you're going to have these loanwords. It's going to be possible to make deals, especially if the coins, the hacked silver's clinking around, That's a different language. That's a symbolic language. Money is a language. Power, expressions of power can be a language. I said I'd be neat. I apologise. I think also the thing about language is it's not just whether you can understand what the other person is saying. So if I go to Italy, I was in Venice last year, And it's a great personal achievement of mine, because I'm as British as they come. I have quite a decent Yorkshire accent. I managed about 8 hours in Venice before anyone spoke any English to me. I was getting by on a very small handful of Italian phrases. I come across like a classic English tourist here, but yeah, I was soaking in Venice. Beautiful. But the one thing you can't learn from just doing a bit of Duolingo, from learning a bit of language, is how that language is used in every sentence. There are different mannerisms, aren't there? There's different inflections, different intonations, and that's a whole other part of learning a different language. And it would have been the same in the early medieval period. To use a really interesting example, and this is from the Viking Age, but it doesn't necessarily concern Scandinavians, are all of the charters from the West Saxon border, so the Sawyer charters. And these are, among many things, they're land grants, they're commentaries about rent, so on, a king gifting certain number of hides, which is like farmsteads, to his friends. And they're on the border between Wessex and Dumnonia, which was a predominantly Celtic-speaking kingdom, situated around what is now Cornwall. And at this pressure point, we used the term earlier, shatter zones, liminal zones, at this pressure zone, between where these kingdoms meet, are charters written in Old English, but they're describing territory that would have been in a kind of Celtic dialectal milieu, if you like. So would the people who these charters would affect, I hate to use the term Celts, but just to simplify this conversation, we'll say Celts. Would these Celts, if they were to read one of these charters, understand how the Old English is used? Because the thing about charters, and I say this in Little Kingdoms, they sound boring. You mention charters to a lot of archaeologists and straight away they're off. And many historians don't value the Sawyer charters. But they're not just these kind of boring, turgid accounts of who owns what land. A charter contains weaponized, biased language. Some of the charters, especially around this particular border, they contain riddles. They describe a river as like a vixen's dyke. They talk about a marsh as Grendel's pit. If you're not immersed in that kind of background, the literary background, the oral culture, and that's mainly from a Germanic language background, Grendel, Beowulf, whatever, would you understand these references? And if you can't understand these references, you wouldn't be able to read the charter. And thus, the people making the charters could then use that misunderstanding to start to shift the borders a bit. And we see this today. This is common tactic. We see people who know more use the ignorance of the other person to get away with things. We see that. And people in the early medieval period were no less conniving than we can be today. Obviously, we don't have charters from Strathclyde. We don't have these beautiful little pockets of information. And as a result, any conversation about the languages flowing around is limited compared to, say, Southern England. But you would have had Old Irish, variations of. Obviously, there's a different conversation about what the Pictish language was. I think mostly we seem to be shifting towards understanding it as closer to Gaelic than initially assumed in the 1950s. Closer to Old Welsh, rather, that's what I meant. But you would have had all of these different accents and dialects and variations, and then hybrid versions. If Old Norse is the language of the new dynasty, the people who are bossing around the trade lanes, monitoring the markets, then that becomes, again in Townend's words, a prestige language. And that's the prestige model of looking at language. It's not just how many languages can you speak, but what is the language that's most useful in X town, in Y market? And just to wrap up, I suppose I mentioned these different languages that aren't just using the spoken word. Humans speak to one another in ways that don't require words. There are symbols, there's art, obviously that beautiful stone behind you, and countless others, even just within Glasgow. And they coded symbols, they carry symbols that carry, I suppose, the modern term meme is actually a really good way to bring this idea to, I suppose, broad audiences. Most people know what a meme is, especially younger audiences. A meme is funny video. It's a way of condensing a lot of information into a short bite form, like a slogan, a 2-second TikTok reel, whatever, or a hogback monument. And the work by the scholar Mark, although he goes by Trix Randerson, brilliant archaeologist, again, someone I'm very lucky to know through doing this work. He's spoken to me about languages of buying, selling and weighing money in these Viking camps, at Coquette Valley, Old Walk, Torksey. Yes, there are coins, Northumbrian issues, Arabic dirhams being lobbed around, but there's also hack silver. There's also weights that are based around hack silver, but then there's cubo-octahedral weights, which are based on Byzantine or Arabic systems. So there are all of these interlocking systems, these different spheres of interaction. And I've moved away, I suppose, from the spoken word here, but it's important to note that I think...
Well, yeah, no, that's fine. We're talking about communication, so it's absolutely...
And just as so people would have been, to some degree, bilingual, they would have understood different dialects and so on, I think people would have also been navigating landscapes of symbolic languages. And that's not just through art, but also through simple acts like what coins you use. And all this is swirling around the conquest of Strathclyde and the movement of the kingdom to another location, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way of ending the main conversation about Strathclyde and what we've discussed so far. We're talking about communication and the fact that humans want to communicate. You're talking about memes, the fact that we want to have certain shortcuts to be able to share a sort of cultural insight that is in a way that people want to share it. So, again, if we're talking about the video version, we've got a horse and rider behind. And if you look at the Duplin cross, for example, it's kind of dead for that. Or my colleague Simon talks about that. He sort of noticed how close it was. And again, the Strathclyders are, talking about this magpie, the shatter zone, that they're telling people, oh, we know what Pictish art is. We've got connections. It's all about communication. It doesn't have to be verbal, as Alex is saying. So, Alex, we're about 40 minutes now, so we'll just begin to draw to an end. But just when you were researching your book, I believe, is out in November, so you can tell us a little bit more about that and remind us of the title. When you were researching that, what was the kind of the takeaway that you took from it, the sort of, if your conclusion of, after having looked at all these small kingdoms, what you think the lessons, what would you do for your next book? What have you learned that, maybe you thought you would learn, your hypothesis going in, or what, has that changed when you're looking at all these unknown smaller kingdoms, these Strathclydes, as it were, these Elmets, these Lindsays? What was your sort of main, as it were, takeaway from writing this book? And again, just remind our listeners and maybe our viewers as well of the title and when it's out, and just what you've learned from writing it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that you use Elmet as an example there, and you said Elmits because, and I won't go into detail, that's obviously for the book, but Elmet is a very well-known name amongst people who like these obscure kingdoms, and there are multiple references to Elmet all over the British Isles. I think there's definitely one in West Yorkshire, there might be one in Wales, let's just say there might be one in Scotland as well. So Elmits, I think, is appropriate rather than just Elmits. But all the information about that kingdom and about 100 more are contained in Little Kingdoms, an A to Z of early medieval Britain, releasing on the 30th of November 2025. Currently, there is actually a discount, I believe, for pre-orders. So it's £5 cheaper. Not that I'm trying to plug that or anything.
No, please do. This is no, but go. There's no shame in it.
Pragmatists like the people who were in the Viking Age. But when I set out to write the book, what inspired me, among many things and people, I was holidaying in Wales. We were hiking, enjoying the brief reprieve from rain. There was a few scant references in books I'd read and on roundabouts in the area to a kingdom called Brycheiniog. And I thought, I know the name, I've seen the name in books, Nancy Edwards, Thomas Charles Edwards, these giants of early medieval Welsh study, they reference kingdoms like that. So I knew of them, but I'm thinking, these are big books. Thomas Charles Edwards has, of course, written Wales and the Britons, this massive, 1,100-page paper where you could probably kill someone with it if you dropped it on them. And we mentioned right at the start, so I suppose it brings this conversation full circle, that kind of book, brilliant, contains so much information, but the average Joe, I suppose, and the type of person who would, as well as us, benefit from information of the highest degree, they're very unlikely to pick up a book like that. That's not at all a comment on the quality of the book. It's seminal for a reason. So my interest in Bricenniog, I thought, I want to learn more about this myself. Started to get invested. I thought, brilliant. And I thought, there's a narrative about this kingdom, perhaps not enough to fill a whole book. Even if there was, would a publisher take that on? Would anyone buy Bricenniog, the book? Perhaps not. So then I start to think there are lots of these, third-rate kingdoms. Another inspiration for me was Thomas Williams' Lost Realms, which is, of course, a book about 9 obscure territories. 2 of them, one in Wales, one in Scotland, and the rest are in England. And I read that book, I really enjoyed it, and I thought, there are more than this 9. And another weird inspiration is the TV show Inside Number 9, which is not at all a history show. It's anthology. One episode might be a tragedy, the next is a comedy, then it's a ghost story, whatever. But each episode's different. They have a different visual language, different dialogue, different banter, completely different style. And you walk away from each one with a snapshot of the episode and you think, oh yeah, the one about the restaurant bill, or the one with Sheridan Smith, I know those, and they're very different in your head. And I wanted to tell little stories like that. In some chapters, it's just a chronological narrative of a kingdom from rise to fall, where we have that evidence. In other cases, it's a list of some of the most fascinating archaeological sites that I've visited or read the grey literature from. So each kingdom tells its own story. And when I started the book, I thought that there'd be, I think, more threads that connect them to serve a grander narrative about not the unification of England, Wales and Scotland, because I think that's a different story, but certainly about what distinguishes communities and so on. But the more I wrote, the more I realised, to the book's benefit, that they're all so different. And I think the takeaway theme or message of Little Kingdoms is one not even rooted in history or archaeology, it's rooted in sociology, which is that for most people, their outlook is local. It's changing in the age of social media, but think of how many people you know. How many of that group are you friends with? How many of your group of friends are you really close with? And then if you just toss all that aside, the people you walk past every day, the things you care about. Most of the time, these are quite local issues or regional. And I think there's certainly merit, and there'll always be merit to approaching the early medieval period from a grander national or international perspective. These big sweeping narratives about the Viking invasion. But analysing these small neighbourhoods, if you like, the Isle of Axholme, Strathclyde, the Isle of Man. And I say small, relatively speaking there, of course. I just mean smaller than a big country. You get to appreciate all of these areas as if they were their own museum exhibits. And you're not looking at anything else around them, you're just looking at them for what they are. And you're getting that sense of flavour, you're getting that hint of uniqueness. So I didn't intend the book, when I started writing it, for it to have as many chapters, or for the chapters to be structured as sporadically as they are. And in some cases, there are some through lines that link chapters together. And I say in the introduction that the title is An A to Z of Early Medieval Britain. It can be read in a random order. I've very much written it so that, say you're about to visit Leeds and you think, oh, I'd like to know a bit about the history of the place between the Romans and the Normans. So you flip to the chapter on Lloydis. You've got about 4 pages there of information and an illustration. Each chapter is accompanied by an illustration that I've done. And you've got enough there to go on to encourage further research. That's the whole aim, of course. But if you were to read it from start to finish, then I think you get a growing sense of momentum, discussions about, among many topics, early medieval ethnicity. What is it? Can we discover it? Can we dissect it? Perhaps not. Read the book, find out. Kingship, fictive kinship, this whole idea of forming bonds with people who you aren't related to by blood, through systems of patronage, through shared cultures. And as a reviewer said, who's read a pre-release copy, in an age where self-identification is so important, and I think it's really good that we acknowledge this, I think tackling the past and looking at how people saw themselves in these little kingdoms, often they don't see themselves as part of these grand regimes. They don't see themselves as West Saxon. Even if a charter says they are, they see themselves as the guys of the village or the people of the valley. And for me, I love that. I think that says a lot about humans, for better or for worse. And I hope people take away that message, among others, when they read the book, when it releases in November. Because it's an anthology, it's like Inside Number 9, like Black Mirror. People will have a favourite chapter, and they might find another one and think, nah, I'm not too bothered about this kingdom. Whoa, look at that one, Penguin. Wow, that's a cool kingdom. And each one will stand on its own. So that would be the dream scenario for people to take away from the book. But of the 3 I've written so far, I love them all dearly, like kids, but Little Kingdoms, there's something about it. I'm really, really fond of it. I think I'm really happy with how it's come together and the impact it's had so far with reviewers and pre-release hype. So thank you for letting me chat about it. I think this is the first time I've spoken about it on a podcast to a big audience. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Alex Harvey, for speaking with the Govan Early Medieval podcast today. And yeah, check out Alex's books. You're on various social medias, so they can just search Alex Harvey, Early Medieval. That should find you on most. Or do you have a website or anything you'd like to push?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. That's very regular updates on there. And yeah, it's funny because there was an Alex Harvey band, and the Alex Harvey was Scottish. So a lot of the time, especially in the AI slop replies sometimes, if you type in Alex Harvey, it will give you a hybridized biography of me and the sensational Alex Harvey band as if we were one person. So yeah, certainly if you type in Alex Harvey Early Medieval, I will come up, or Alex Harvey Vikings, that's me. But just Alex Harvey, I seem to be battling with a famous rock star. So we'll see how that duel ends.
We're talking about hybrid identities, so there's one. There's one for you. Well, thank you so much, Alex, and hopefully we'll get you back on maybe once the book's out, or maybe you can come up to the delights of Governhold and maybe talk about the book in person. We'd love to have that.
Absolutely. Can't mean. And thank you very much for having me. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much. All right, all the best. Bye.